It is often said that nothing is new under the sun. Great powers always fought in colonial wars, both by using their proxies and directly. While the Ottoman Empire was on the rise in the early 16th century and fighting wars on numerous fronts, it was challenged by the burgeoning Portuguese Empire in the Indian Ocean. Today's video will explore the origins of the conflict between the two empires and cover the Battle of Diu in 1538, as Portugal and the Ottomans fight for dominance over India. In our opinion, learning new stuff and developing yourself is an essential part of being human. In our fast-paced world, it's often difficult to find enough time though, as our work, social lives and hobbies take most of our time. It's natural to think you don't have enough time to read a book, but the sponsor of this video, Blinkist, is here to help you with that problem. This is a unique app that takes the most important insights, new developments and know-how from thousands of non-fiction books, condensing them into a 15-minute long read or listen. As we have to work almost 24/7 to produce our videos, Blinkist is essential for our personal growth. If you're interested in the history of the era and the Ottomans, you will love Age of Discovery by Ian Goldin and Chris Kutana, as it draws useful parallels between the 16th century and our era, and The Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan, which talks about the creation of the trade network across Asia. The first 100 people to go to blinkist.com/kingsandgenerals are going to get unlimited access for 1 week to try it out. You'll also get 25% off if you want the full membership. Since Vasco da Gama first reached India after a circumnavigation of Africa in 1498, the reach and power of the Portuguese had been growing rapidly in the Indian Ocean. In 1500, the same Portuguese armada that had made first landfall in Brazil continued on to India, bombarding Calicut and establishing Portugal's first Asian factory in Cochin. By 1504, Portuguese ships were regularly plundering Arab shipping in the Indian Ocean, with a blockade of the Red Sea earning them the ire of the Mamluk Sultanate and of their trading partner Venice. But despite Venetian encouragement and Ottoman material support for a coalition of Muslim powers against Portugal, little effective resistance was forthcoming in the early years of this Portuguese piracy. The political fragmentation of Western India allowed the Portuguese to find ready allies despite their hostile bearing and the enmity of so many sultanates and city-states. And Mamluk Egypt, ruled as it was by an elite slave soldier class, had long neglected naval concerns in favour of their famed cavalry armies. After a decisive Portuguese victory at the Battle of Diu in 1509 against Calicut, the Mamluks and the Sultanate of Gujarat, Portugal's dominance in the Indian Ocean would be unchallenged for nearly 3 decades. Central to these early Portuguese campaigns was Alfonso de Albuquerque, a masterful admiral and statesman. Acting with considerable autonomy in waters far distant from his homeland, he had already seized Muscat and Hormuz before the Muslim stand at Diu, and was elevated to become governor of Portuguese India in the same year, with the conquest of Goa following soon after. Despite a failure to capture Aden, by his death in 1515, Alfonso had established an effective network of ports and bases that would allow the Portuguese to fight on even terms a world away from their home shores. For the Mamluks, on the other hand, the loss of Indian trade was devastating. The flourishing trade port of Alexandria fell into stagnation and decline, with spices instead flowing into Lisbon. In an attempt to make up the loss, the Mamluks turned to oppressive taxation, causing instability and discontent. This proved to be one of the greatest factors in allowing the Ottoman Sultan Selim to rapidly defeat what had once been a major rival, with the local nobility of Syria defecting en masse to Selim when he invaded in 1516. By the beginning of February 1517, Ottoman armies had entered Cairo and subjugated the nation. In doing so, Selim indirectly landed his first blow against the Portuguese, as their initial aim had been to capture Egypt and take control of the established trade routes, rather than diverting them through a long chain of expensive and vulnerable bases. But Egypt's change in rulers did not change the realities faced by Arab merchants in the Indian Ocean, and the Ottomans quickly found that they had inherited their predecessors' piracy crisis. Although no outright hostilities would occur between the Ottomans and the Portuguese during the reign of Selim, there was no doubt that war was inevitable, and each empire sought to gain allies and influence among the local rulers of India and East Africa in order to strengthen their position. Of chief importance were the ports of Aden, Hormuz, Basra and Diu, most of which would change hands more than once over the decades to follow. In their search for allies against the Portuguese, the Ottomans found common cause with the Somali sultanates of Adel and Ajuran, and with the Sultanate of Gujarat in northwestern India. Gujarat had formerly been a dominant regional power before the Mughal Empire's incursions by land and Portuguese power at sea left it weakened and diminished, forced into tributary status to stronger empires to retain its autonomy. After being on the losing side of the Battle of Diu, a humiliating defeat in the heart of its territory, Gujarat would turn to the Ottomans for aid in maintaining control of its crucial trade ports. With the Balkan and Persian Wars still looming, and without access to the Persian Gulf, however, direct Ottoman intervention would be minimal at first. Some efforts were made to shore up the Ottoman Red Sea Fleet prior to the capture of Basra. In 1525, Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha reorganized the old Mamluk fleet, with Selman Reis again serving as admiral after a short imprisonment, possibly for his earlier defection to the Mamluks. Having already beaten the Portuguese fleet once off Jeddah in 1517, arranging his galleys in a tight formation under the cover of the shore batteries so as to force the ocean-going Portuguese ships to either retreat or fight a Mediterranean-style battle of boarders and fire ships, Selman managed to do what both the Mamluks and the Portuguese had failed to do, and secured effective control of Yemen by 1527. This marked the first serious Ottoman challenge to Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean, and Selman's victories encouraged the numerous Muslim rulers in Western India to turn to the Ottoman Empire for protection as their suzerain. In the following years, Ottoman soldiers and military experts would be sent to the courts of Gujarat and Calicut, simultaneously strengthening the defences of crucial port cities, increasing the influence of the Ottoman Sultan abroad, and giving credibility to his recently adopted title of Caliph. One of these consulting Ottoman generals would soon be called on to do battle with the Portuguese on the site of the Portuguese triumph of 1509, Diu. Together with Surat on the opposite side of the Gulf of Cambet, Diu was among the most important trading hubs of Western India, and would represent a major prize for the Portuguese. It was thus in Diu that the Ottoman-Portuguese Wars would start in earnest, with a large Portuguese fleet of over 400 ships, carrying close to 6,000 soldiers, attacking the city's Gujarati and Ottoman garrison in 1531. Led by Alfonso's successor as governor of Portuguese India, Admiral Nuno de Cunha, this new fleet was significantly stronger than the one that had been victorious against the Mamluks in 1509. And unlike the first fleet, this one carried a fearsome mixed army of Portuguese soldiers and conscripted auxiliaries from the Malabar coast, which had shown its effectiveness in numerous engagements already. However, despite boasting complete naval superiority over the mere 18 Ottoman ships arrayed against them, de Cunha had met his match in Mustafa Bayram. The unparalleled Ottoman artillery crews dealt severe damage to the besiegers, while the narrow waterways separating Diu Island from the mainland frustrated Portuguese efforts to bring the firepower of their large fleet to bear. This first siege of Diu demonstrated the limitations of both empires. While de Cunha could not overcome the combination of Gujarati numbers and Ottoman gunnery to capture the city, neither could Mustafa Bayram destroy de Cunha's fleet to end the threat it posed. The fortress remained Gujarati, but the sea remained Portuguese, with de Cunha plundering Surat and other poorly defended Gujarati ports after withdrawing in defeat from Diu. The Ottoman-Portuguese Wars would not begin in earnest until 7 years later, though. In a bizarre twist, the roles of the two empires would be almost completely reversed in the second siege. Increasing military pressure from the Mughal Empire, combined with the inability of the Ottomans to protect their maritime interests, drove Sultan Bahadur to sign the Treaty of Bassein in 1534 and cede numerous islands and territories, including Bombay and Diu, despite the successful defense of the city 3 years prior. In the same year, Suleiman took Baghdad from the Safavids and gained the nominal fealty of Basra, opening a new avenue to the Indian Ocean. With his war in Persia ending and affairs in Europe quiet for the time being, Suleiman finally turned to confront the Portuguese head-on, building shipyards in the Suez and Yemen and greatly expanding his Red Sea fleet. The drowning of Sultan Bahadur during negotiations aboard a Portuguese vessel in 1537 provided the spark of war, and in 1538, the Ottoman fleet under the command of Hadim Suleiman Pasha attacked Diu Fort, laying siege to the same city they had helped defend 7 years prior. Although the Ottoman fleet numbered only 80 ships, compared to the 400 ships the Portuguese had fielded in 1531, they were of heavier build than the light galleys comprising most of the Portuguese fleet, and it carried a similar force of soldiers. Though a naval engagement still would have favoured the Portuguese, the Ottoman Armada had caught the Portuguese largely by surprise and arrived unopposed on September 4th after capturing and plundering Aden en route. De Cunha and other Portuguese admirals had expected the Ottoman fleet to make for Muscat or Hormuz, but once again it was here, Diu. Upon landing, the 6,000 Turkish soldiers aboard the royal galleys of the Armada disembarked to join a larger force of 16,000 Gujarati soldiers under the command of Qajar Safar, which had been besieging the fortress for the past 2 months, though with little success due to a lack of ships and cannon. Also present was the Ottoman captain Hoja Safaj, who maintained a small Turkish force in Gujarat after Mustafa Bayram's departure to preserve the waning influence of the Ottoman Sultan over their Indian ally. With only 3,000 Portuguese in the fort, of which only 600 were soldiers under Antonio de Silveira's command, the vastly superior Ottoman and Gujarati numbers appeared insurmountable, especially when backed by Ottoman siege gunnery. But the Portuguese still held a number of advantages. Firstly, the fort they were defending was newly built along European lines, greatly superior to the outdated medieval fortifications it had replaced. A small bastion in the channel to the north, placed halfway between the fort and a redoubt on the mainland, allowed chains to be drawn across the Diu Channel to cut off the Ottoman galleys. Secondly, the alliance between Suleiman and Mahmud Shah III of Gujarat was weaker than it might seem. Despite the Portuguese having abandoned the city of Diu without battle upon the arrival of the Gujarati army, falling back into the fort to make their stand, a force of Ottoman janissaries ransacked it shortly after disembarking. The senseless damage enraged many Gujarati nobles, and with Mahmud Shah's succession already disputed, he risked losing his throne if too much of the nobility turned against his Ottoman patrons. This diplomatic breakdown would hamper the Ottomans in the coming siege, with the Gujaratis reluctant to supply the hungry Ottoman force. And lastly, the Ottomans were not willing to risk their fleet in open battle so far from their home shores, putting them under pressure to capture the fort quickly before Portuguese reinforcements from Goa could arrive. Despite these various disadvantages, the Ottomans made rapid progress building siege works about the surrounded fort, and by September 28th, a punishing bombardment was underway. But the first hasty attempts to storm the walls were repulsed with significant losses. As the volleys continued over the coming month, various attempts would be made to weaken the defences. First, Qajar Safar targeted the Portuguese strongpoint on the north bank of the Diu Channel, assaulting it with Gujarati forces backed up by Ottoman guns. The small fort's 40 Portuguese defenders held firm, however, and Qajar's attempt to smoke the defenders out with fire ships was foiled when a Portuguese nighttime attack lit the craft prematurely. this initial Portuguese victory would be short-lived. On October 1st, the redoubt's commander, Francisco Pacheco, was forced to surrender after narrowly beating back a second assault by hardened Janissaries. Despite an agreement between Suleiman Pasha and Pacheco to grant safe passage to the fort, the remaining defenders were imprisoned on the Pasha's galley. The redoubt had been silenced, though this was a small victory, and all the Ottomans had to show for most of a month of effort. In an attempt to avoid the losses a continued siege would entail, Suleiman Pasha had the captured de Pacheco write a letter to de Silveira, detailing the good treatment he had received on the Pasha's galley and the overwhelming power of the Ottoman army in an attempt to secure de Silveira's surrender. This would prove unsuccessful, however, with de Silveira viewing Pacheco's imprisonment as an act of treachery by Suleiman. With the negotiations a failure, the Ottomans returned to the siege, with the last of their artillery unloaded and in place by October 5th. But even with the full force of their army brought to bear, attempts to assault the fortress through the partially collapsed bulwarks on October 12th and 13th failed, and the efforts of Ottoman sappers to breach the walls with gunpowder charges were hampered by barricades erected within the walls by Portuguese non-combatants. The next target of the besiegers would be the sea fort in the Diu Channel, with Ottoman galleys attempting to storm it on October 27th and 28th. But without any surrounding landmass to disembark besiegers on, attackers would be forced to scale the sea fort's walls directly from their galleys, a difficult task in the face of the cannon fire and firebombs of the well-stocked Portuguese garrison. 18 galleys in total would be committed between the two attacks, but despite significant casualties, the defenders of the sea fort successfully weathered the attacks and forced the battered galleys into retreat. After the failure to capture the sea fort, the cracks were beginning to show in the Allied siege effort. The simmering dispute between the Ottomans and the Gujarati nobility left Suleiman Pasha's army in a precarious position for supplies, and despite the strength of the Ottoman fleet, they were unable to prevent swift Portuguese foists from making landings to resupply and reinforce the defenders. Faced with the possibility of being cut off by the Portuguese fleet in Goa, Suleiman Pasha could not risk prolonging the fruitless siege. On October 30th, the Ottoman forces began withdrawing back to their ships. De Silveira knew better than to drop his guard while still surrounded, however. His vigilance would pay off when the Ottoman retreat proved to be a last ruse by Suleiman Pasha, who launched a massive final attack on the morning of the 31st. The majority of the Ottoman Gujarati army, as many as 14,000, attacked under a heavy artillery barrage. The 600 soldiers that had held the fort at the beginning of the siege had since dwindled to 100 or fewer, with more of the soldiers now imprisoned on Ottoman galleys than remaining to defend the fort. But with the situation as dire as it had become, much of the fort's civilian population took up arms in its defense as well, with some sources suggesting a group of female soldiers saw active duty in the frenzied battle. Damage to the fortress bulwarks was severe, and at several points along the walls, Gujarati or Ottoman soldiers succeeded in winning their way onto the ramparts to raise their banners above the beleaguered fort. But just as in the initial assaults, the time constraints the besiegers faced worked against them. In their haste to crush the remaining opposition, the troops attacking the walls were exposed to significant friendly fire from the ongoing cannon volleys. Though the fighting on October 31st would stretch the defenders to the breaking point, the attackers were again repulsed, and though similar attacks on the following days would have inevitably ended in an Ottoman victory, no more would be forthcoming. A relief force of 24 Portuguese galleys was mistaken for the vanguard of the governor's powerful Goa fleet, while a small sortie by the remaining defenders created the impression that the fort was still garrisoned to withstand another attack. On November 6th, the Ottoman fleet hurriedly embarked for Yemen, while Qajar Safar torched his camp and withdrew to the mainland. A mere 40 soldiers remained fit for battle inside the fort when the relief fleet arrived, yet they had held off the largest Ottoman expedition ever dispatched to India, with the Turkish armada returning to Yemen 1,200 men lighter. The failure to capture Diu was a major loss for the Ottomans, weakening their influence in India and straining their critical alliance with the Gujarat Sultanate. Spice would continue to work its way around the Cape of Good Hope, with even the merchants of Venice at times forced to purchase from their Portuguese rivals. But Suleiman's efforts in the Indian Ocean had not been for naught. The construction of shipyards in Basra and Aden had greatly strengthened the Ottoman position compared to the feeble Mamluks, while Ibrahim Pasha and Selman Reis's improved fleet had forced the Portuguese to end their long Red Sea blockade. Therefore, though the Ottomans had failed to drive the Portuguese from the Indian Ocean, they did succeed in reinvigorating the Egyptian spice trade, with Arab and Indian merchants again braving the risk of Portuguese piracy to sell their wares in Alexandria. The old and new trade routes would uneasily coexist over the next decades as the rival empires competed for dominance. Next time on the Ottoman-Portuguese Wars, we cross the Indian Ocean to the African theatre, where the mighty nations of Ethiopia and Adel battle for dominance under the watchful eyes of their imperial backers. So make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.